$200 billion. Let that number sink into your gray matter for a second. It is a number so large it ceases to be money and becomes gravity. It is the GDP of a mid-sized European nation. It is enough to buy a private navy. It is the current valuation of the empire of the swoosh. You see the logo on the feet of billionaires, on the jerseys of gods, and on the sweat-stained shirts of factory workers in Bangladesh. But before it was a cultural monolith, before it was a brand that could dictate the moral compass of a generation, it was a lie. A beautiful, desperate $50 lie. And here is the punchline that should make you furious at your own hesitation. The entire thing was built on a credit card balance and a delusional kid who just wanted to beat the Germans. Rewind to 1962. Forget the boardroom. We are going to Oregon. Meet Phil Knight. He isn't a titan of industry. He's a shy, pale, aimless 24-year-old drifting through life like a plastic bag in the wind. He's got a degree from Stanford, which usually means a one-way ticket to a cubicle in a skyscraper. But Phil has what he calls a crazy idea. You know the type. That nagging, itching thought in the back of your skull that tells you to ruin your life for a chance at glory. At Stanford, he wrote a paper. It wasn't about just do it. It was about arbitrage. It was about cold, hard economics. The premise was simple. Japanese cameras had killed German cameras. Why couldn't Japanese shoes kill German shoes? At the time, Adidas and Puma were the Axis powers of athletic footwear. They owned the track. They owned the gold medals. If you were an athlete, you wore German stripes or you ran barefoot. Knight looked at this monopoly and didn't see superior engineering. He saw a fat, complacent target. He reasoned that he could import high-quality, low-cost running shoes from Japan, where labor was cheap and the post-war economy was hungry, and undercut the European giants in the American market. It wasn't about passion yet. It was about the spread. It was a hustle. But ideas are cheap. Logistics are expensive. Knight is broke. He's a shoe dog with no shoes. So, he does what every great entrepreneur in history has done. He goes to his daddy. He walks into his father's den, a room that smells of old paper and conservatism, and asks for money to import shoes from a country the United States had been at war with less than 20 years prior. You have to understand the audacity. This is like asking your dad today for money to import nuclear reactors from North Korea because you think they have potential. His father, a respectable man who believed in stability, probably thought his son had lost his mind, but he wrote the check, $50. That is it. That is the seed capital of the Nike empire, $50. That wouldn't buy you a single sneaker today, but in 1962, it was the ticket to the game. Knight takes that $50, packs a bag, and books a flight to the other side of the world, armed with nothing but a theory and a terrifying lack of experience. He is walking into the lion's den, and he doesn't even have a whip. You think business is about spreadsheets and 5-year plans? Please. Real business, the kind that alters the trajectory of the planet, is about poker. It is about staring a stranger in the face and lying with the conviction of a saint. Phil Knight lands in Kobe, Japan, and he is a fish out of water. Actually, he is a fish on the surface of the moon. Japan in 1962 is not the neon-soaked cyberpunk wonderland you see today. It is a country pulling itself out of the rubble, rebuilding its soul with steel and discipline. And here comes this lanky American kid looking for a shoe factory. He finds Onitsuka Shipperbernshides, the makers of the tiger shoe. He walks into the conference room, and suddenly the air leaves the room. He is surrounded by stern Japanese executives who have been doing business since before Knight was born. They look at him. He looks at them. And then the imposter syndrome hits him like a freight train. He realizes he is nobody. He has no company. He has no equity. He has $50 in a suit that probably doesn't fit quite right. He is a tourist playing dress up. They ask him the question, The question that kills dreams. Who do you represent, Mr. Knight? Time stops. In that split second, Phil Knight has two choices. He can tell the truth. I am Phil Knight. I live in my parents' house, and I really like running. If he says that, he is politely escorted out, flies home, gets a job as an accountant, and you never wear a pair of Jordans. Or he can lie. He remembers the blue ribbons he won running track. His brain misfires and spits out a hallucination. I represent Blue Ribbon Sports of Portland, Oregon. Boom. In that moment, a corporation is born. Not on paper, not in a lawyer's office, but in the panicked synapses of a desperate kid's brain. Blue Ribbon Sports did not exist. It had no office, no phone number, and 0 employees. It was a ghost. But the Onitsuka executives? They didn't know that. They saw an American in a suit, and they saw a gateway to the Holy Land, the U.S. consumer market. They wanted to sell shoes to Americans, and here was this executive offering to do it for them. They nodded. They bowed. They shook hands. They agreed to send him samples. Knight walked out of that meeting, trying not to hyperventilate. He had done it. He had secured the distribution rights for the Western United States for a major Japanese shoe brand. There was just one tiny catastrophic problem. He didn't have the money to pay for the shipment. He didn't have a warehouse to store them. He barely had a ride home. He returns to Oregon and enters the most excruciating phase of the startup life cycle, the wait. For months, nothing happens. He writes letters. Silence. He starts to think he imagined the whole thing, that the Japanese executives had realized he was a fraud and were laughing at him over sake. He gets a job as an accountant to pass the time, crunching numbers for other people's businesses, while his own imaginary empire gathers dust in his mind. But then, a slip of paper arrives. The shoes are coming. The bluff worked. The game is on. So, the shoes arrive. 12 pairs of creamy white tiger running shoes. Phil Knight holds them like they are religious artifacts. But here is the cold shower of reality. Having a product is not the same as having a business. You can have the cure for death in a bottle, but if nobody knows you exist, you're just a guy with a weird bottle. Well, Knight needs a partner. He needs someone who isn't just a bean counter, but a believer. He needs a high priest of speed. Enter Bill Bowerman. If Knight is the brain of this operation, Bowerman is the soul and the mad scientist. Bowerman was the legendary track coach at the University of Oregon, a man who didn't just train runners. He engineered them. He was obsessed, bordering on the psychotic. With weight. He believed that 1 ounce shaved off a shoe meant 55 pounds less lifted over a mile. He was known to tear apart shoes, mix rubber in his kitchen, and probably poison himself with fumes, all in the name of making a human being move 0.1 seconds faster. Knight sends a pair to his old coach, hoping for a sale. Bowerman doesn't just buy them. He says, I want in. He wants to design. He wants equity. They shake hands. A handshake deal between a nervous accountant and a track god. They each put in $500. Now, the war chest is a staggering $1,000. Now, picture the headquarters of Blue Ribbon Sports. It is not a gleaming glass tower in Beaverton. It is the trunk of Phil Knight's green Plymouth Valiant. This is the glamour of entrepreneurship that Instagram forgets to tell you about. There is no receptionist. There is no espresso machine. There is just Phil driving to every high school track meet in the Pacific Northwest, parking his car, popping the trunk, and standing there like a peddler of illicit goods. He would spot a kid warming up, a kid with bleeding blisters and heavy leather clodhoppers on his feet, and he would pitch him. Not with a slogan, but with physics. Try these. They're lighter. You'll fly. And they did. The runners put on the Tigers, and they felt like they were running on clouds compared to the German tanks they were used to. The shoes sold themselves. Knight wasn't a salesman. He was a missionary. He was spreading the gospel of Japanese rubber. They sold out of the first shipment, then the second, then the third. Knight was still working his day job as an accountant, crunching numbers for the real world by day and slinging shoes from his trunk by night. The living room of his parents' house became the warehouse. Shoeboxes were stacked to the ceiling, blocking the windows, a fortress of cardboard. His poor mother was probably tripping over inventory just to get to the kitchen. But something was happening. A cult was forming. It wasn't a brand yet. It was a secret society of runners who knew that the guy in the green Valiant had the magic goods. In their first year, they made $8,000. That is less than the catering budget for a single Nike meeting today. But to Knight and Bowerman, it was proof. The German giants were sleeping, arrogant and heavy on the throne, and two guys in Oregon were starting to gnaw at their ankles. The trunk hustle was over. They needed a building. They needed employees. And most terrifying of all, they needed a lot more money. You have been lied to. Business schools, movies, and that uncle who gives you unsolicited advice have all told you that the goal of a business is profit. Wrong. The goal of a startup is survival. You can be profitable on paper and still be dead in the water if you run out of cash. And for the first decade of its life, Blue Ribbon Sports was suffocating. It was the ultimate paradox. The faster they grew, the closer they came to dying. Imagine you buy a shoe for $5 and sell it for $10. You made $5, right? Great, now you have $10. But because demand is exploding, you need to buy 2 pairs for the next round. That costs $10. So you have $0 left. You have doubled your inventory, doubled your sales, and you are completely broke. Now, multiply that by 1,000,000. Phil Knight was driving the company like a getaway car with the gas pedal welded to the floor. Every dime that came in was instantly wire transferred to Japan to buy more tigers. They were doubling sales every year, which sounds like a success story, but to their bank, it looked like a suicide pact. The bankers in the 1960s were not the cocaine-fueled gamblers of Wall Street today. They were conservative men who wore suspenders and hated risk. They looked at Knight's balance sheet, which was basically all debt and inventory, and saw a disaster waiting to happen. They wanted equity. Knight had none. They wanted cash reserves. Knight had shoes. This brings us to the float. This is a financial term for living dangerously. Knight and his team would write checks to pay creditors on a Friday, knowing full well there was zero money in the account. They were betting their lives that the sales from the weekend would get deposited on Monday morning before the checks cleared. It was a weekly high-wire act over a pit of spikes. If the sales were slow or if the bank processed the check too fast, it was jail time for fraud. Finally, the inevitable happened. The Bank of California had seen enough. The manager called Knight in and told him, "We no longer want your business." They were kicked out. Frozen. This is the moment where most people fold. You have no money, your bank just dumped you, and you owe thousands of dollars to a Japanese factory that doesn't care about your problems. Knight had to go begging to other banks, getting rejected over and over, until he found a tiny branch of the Bank of Tokyo in Portland that was willing to take a chance on the crazy idea. They survived by the skin of their teeth, but the lesson was seared into Knight's brain. You are never safe. The money isn't yours until the game is over. And the game was about to get a lot harder because their partner in Japan was sharpening a knife. You think your biggest enemy is the competition? That's cute. In the brutal geometry of business, the competition is just an obstacle. The real danger, the one that keeps you up at 3 a.m. sweating through your sheets, is the partner who realizes they don't need you anymore. By the early 1970s, Blue Ribbon Sports was selling millions of dollars worth of tiger shoes. They had done the impossible. They had taken a niche Japanese brand and made it cool in America. And how did Onitsuka thank them? Did they send a fruit basket? Did they offer a better margin? No, they decided to eat them alive. Enter the villain of our story, the Kitami. He was the export manager for Onitsuka, a man with the warmth of a reptilian predator. He flew to the U.S. ostensibly to check on operations. But Knight, whose paranoia had now evolved into a survival instinct, sensed the shark in the water. While Kitami was busy in a meeting, Knight did something you won't find in a Harvard ethics textbook. He stole a folder from Kitami's briefcase. He opened it, and there it was, the kill order. Onitsuka was secretly shopping around for new distributors in the U.S. They were planning to cut Blue Ribbon Sports out of the picture entirely. They had used Knight to build the market, and now that the heavy lifting was done, they wanted to keep all the profit for themselves. It is the classic corporate backstab. Thanks for building the house. Now get out. Then came the ultimatum. Onitsuka dropped the hammer. They told Knight, sell us 51% of your company, or we cut off your supply. It wasn't an offer. It was a hostage negotiation. If Knight sold, he would lose control of his life's work. He would become an employee in his own company, a puppet for Tokyo. If he refused, Onitsuka would stop shipping shoes immediately. Blue Ribbon Sports had no factory, no molds, and no other product. Without tigers, they were just a warehouse full of empty cardboard boxes. They would be bankrupt in a week. Knight looked them in the eye and did the only thing he could do. He lied. Again, he smiled and said, that sounds like an interesting proposition. Let me think it over. He bought time. But the second he walked out of that room, the clock started ticking. He knew the marriage was over. He was standing on a trapdoor with a noose around his neck. He had to find a way to manufacture his own shoes, build his own brand, and hide the whole operation from Onitsuka until he was ready to jump. He was about to cheat on his supplier, and if he got caught, he was dead. Here we are at the precipice. Knight has a gun to his head, courtesy of his Japanese partners, and he needs a miracle. He needs a new shoe, a new name, and a new identity, and he needs it yesterday. If he fails, he's not just broke. He's a traitor to the only supplier he has. First, the name. You'd think a multi-billion-dollar brand name comes from a focus group of geniuses in a glass room drinking sparkling water. Wrong. Knight wanted to call the company Dimension 6. Can you imagine? Just Do It, brought to you by Dimension 6. It sounds like a bad sci-fi movie. His employees hated it. They begged him to change it. Finally, one of his first employees, Jeff Johnson, wakes up from a dream. He says the name came to him in the night. Nike, the Greek goddess of victory. Knight hates it. He thinks it sounds like a weird foreign word. But they have to print the boxes, so he shrugs and says, I guess we'll go with the goddess. That is how close we came to living in a world without Nike. A shrug and a deadline. Now, the logo. Knight finds a graphic design student at Portland State University named Carolyn Davidson. She's broke. He's cheap. He offers her $2 an hour. She draws some squiggles. He looks at them and frowns. He points to a fat checkmark-looking thing and says, I don't love it, but maybe it will grow on me. He writes her a check for $35. $35 for the swoosh. Today, that logo is more recognizable than the crucifix, and he bought it for the price of a tank of gas. It is the greatest ROI in the history of capitalism. But a cool logo and a Greek name don't mean anything if the shoes suck. They needed an innovation. They needed traction. Enter Bill Bowerman and Sunday morning breakfast. Bowerman is sitting in his kitchen, staring at his wife's waffle iron. Most people see breakfast. Bowerman sees the future of friction. He thinks, if the waffle pattern traps syrup, maybe it can grip the track. He doesn't do a feasibility study. He doesn't call a chemical engineer. He grabs a vat of toxic liquid urethane and pours it directly into his wife's waffle iron. The kitchen fills with poisonous smoke. The waffle iron is fused shut, destroyed forever, a sacrifice to the gods of speed. But when he pries it open, he holds the waffle soul. It is light, It is grippy. And it is weird. It is the first shoe that is truly theirs. So now they have the swoosh, the name Nike, and the waffle shoe. They go to the National Sporting Goods Association show in Chicago. This is the divorce party. Knight is still technically working with Onitsuka, but he sets up a booth for Nike. When the Japanese executives find out, it is war. They sue him. He sues them. It is a messy, ugly, glorious legal battle. But Knight has something they don't. He has the waffle. And for the first time, he isn't selling someone else's shoes. He is selling his own soul, molded in rubber. The middleman is dead. The brand is born. You know that feeling when you hold a lottery ticket, and for a split second, you imagine a life where you don't have to set an alarm clock? Now imagine that feeling lasts for 40 years. We have arrived at the promised land, the liquidity event, the IPO. For nearly 2 decades, Phil Knight and his band of misfits, the Shoe Dogs, had been living on the edge of a cliff. They were liquidity poor, asset rich, and stress heavy. They were pirates on a leaky boat, bailing water with one hand and firing cannons with the other. But in December 1980, the pirates decided to become the Navy. They decided to take Nike public. This is the moment where capitalism performs its greatest magic trick. It turns sweat equity into FU money. On December 6, 1980, Nike offered shares to the public. The banks that once slammed the door in Knight's face were now lining up to underwrite the deal, salivating for a piece of the action. The hypocrisy of finance is breathtaking, isn't it? When you need money, you are a leper. When you have money, you are a messiah. The stock opened. The market didn't just bite. It swallowed the hook, line, and sinker. By the time the closing bell rang, Phil Knight, the guy who had to beg his dad for $50, the guy who sold shoes out of a green Plymouth Valiant, was worth $178 million. Let's put that in perspective. He didn't just get rich. He entered the stratosphere. And it wasn't just him. The early employees, the guys who had worked for peanuts and passion, the guys who slept in the warehouse and breathed glue fumes, suddenly found themselves holding stock options worth millions. It was the ultimate vindication. The crazy idea was no longer crazy. It was a 9-figure asset. But there is a dark irony to the IPO, a shadow that follows every company that rings that bell. When you go public, you sell your soul. Before 1980, Phil Knight answered to nobody but his conscience and his bank balance. After 1980, he answered to the shareholder. And let me tell you, the shareholder is a cruel master. The shareholder doesn't care about the spirit of running. The shareholder doesn't care about the waffle iron. The shareholder cares about one thing, the line going up. Suddenly, Nike wasn't just a shoe company. It was a quarterly earnings machine. The pressure shifted from survival to growth at all costs. And when you prioritize growth above all else, strange things start to happen. You start looking for cheaper labor. You start squeezing suppliers. You start marketing the idea of greatness while outsourcing the actual work to the lowest bidder. The pirates had won the treasure, but they had to trade their ship for a corporate boardroom. They were rich, yes, but the days of the trunk hustle were dead and buried under a mountain of cash. Stop next step. Would you like me to continue to part 8, where we look at the legacy, the labor scandals, and the irony of just do it? And so we arrive at the end of the track, the finish line. Phil Knight, the pale kid from Oregon, who hyperventilated in front of Japanese executives, is now a myth. He is the Zeus of the pantheon he built. But let's look at what that pantheon actually is today. It is no longer a scrappy rebellion against the German establishment. It is the establishment. Nike has become the very thing it set out to destroy. A colossal, hulking monopoly that dominates the landscape with an iron fist wrapped in a moisture-wicking glove. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife. The company, started by a guy who cared about the souls of runners, eventually became the poster child for crushing the souls of workers. You remember the 90s? The sweatshops? The photos of children stitching soccer balls for pennies? That is the tax of empire. You don't get to a $200 billion valuation by playing nice. You get there by optimizing costs until the humanity is squeezed out of the supply chain like water from a sponge. The shoe dog became the Wolf of Wall Street, just with better PR. And speaking of PR, let's talk about the greatest trick the devil ever pulled. Just do it. 3 words. That's it. But those 3 words convinced a generation that buying a sneaker was a moral act. They convinced you that if you bought these shoes, you weren't a consumer. You were an athlete. You were Michael Jordan. You were Tiger Woods. You were defying gravity. It is the ultimate capitalist alchemy, transmuting rubber and glue into hope and glory. They stopped selling shoes a long time ago. Now they sell identity. They sell the feeling of winning to people who are losing. So, when you look at that swoosh today, don't just see a check mark. See the paradox. See the $50 bill that Phil Knight borrowed from his dad, a bill that multiplied like a virus until it covered the earth. See the brilliance of the hustle, the audacity of the lie, and the grit of the trunk sales. But also see the cost. See the waffle iron destroyed in the kitchen, and see the factories in Asia. The story of Nike isn't just a success story. It is a warning. It tells us that with enough delusion, enough debt, and enough sheer force of will, you can build a kingdom. But it also asks you a question, one that Phil Knight probably asks himself in the quiet of his mansion. When you finally catch the car you've been chasing for 40 years, and you look in the rearview mirror at the wreckage you left behind, was it worth the run? The $50 is gone. The shoes are worn out. But the empire remains. And it all started because a kid was too scared to tell the truth in a conference room in Kobe. So, the next time you have a crazy idea, remember Phil Knight. Lie to the bank, ruin the waffle iron. Just do it. Just don't say I didn't warn you about the finish line.